Okay, thanks everyone for coming, and thanks to Jacob for inviting me to give this talk. So my title is Center Indifference and Skepticism. And I should preface my talk by saying, unlike a lot of talks in the series, I'm not going to be sort of talking about the details of any particular physical theory. Rather, my goal is to talk about probability. And in particular, I'm going to be talking about indifference principles with respect to self-locating probabilities. So this sort of general topic of self-locating principles and indifference principles, I think, has seen a lot of discussion in the foundations of physics. So in questions about interpretations of quantum mechanics, particularly the many worlds interpretation, questions about statistical mechanics, and questions about the measure problem in cosmology and the so-called Boltzmann brane problem. So a lot of these topics have been touched on in different ways in the foundations of physics. My goal is I'm going to be talking about these issues generally and looking at how some metaphysical debates might impact on these issues. And then I'll be talking about how these might relate to discussions in the foundations of physics. So the talk will have two main parts. So the first part will just be directly on indifference principles with respect to self-locating indifference. And there I'll be talking about how I think issues in metaphysics might bear on our understanding of these principles. And so one of my goals of this talk is to try to interrelate certain discussions that people are having in metaphysics circles with discussions that people are having in foundations of physics circles. And then after that big part of the talk, in the second part, I'll try to apply some of the things I've said in various kinds of cases. I'll consider a toy case to illustrate some of the distinctive features of the principle I'll defend. And then I'll look at the Boltzmann brane argument. I'll look at the simulation argument of whether we all live in a computer simulation. And I'll also look at questions about our knowledge of the laws of physics and how what I say might be relevant to that. Okay, so that's the broad outline. Let's start with part one. So I'll start with a very concrete initial case that I hope that a lot of you have some intuitions about. So here's a concrete case. Let's call it two rooms. Suppose there are two indistinguishable rooms, room 1 and 2, and you know that you're in one of them. And each room contains a single agent. Both agents in the rooms are perfect duplicates. Question, how confident should you be that you're in the first room? It seems like a very natural thing to want to say is you should be 50-50 confident that you're in the first room versus the second room. And a lot of people have been attracted to this kind of answer in the literature. And really the whole goal of this talk will be to try to extract a general principle from this very initial intuitive judgment and to look at some of its broader applications, both in the foundations of physics and elsewhere. Okay, so here's a way to get started on that project. So a lot of people in the literature introduce this notion of a centered world. What is a centered world? A centered world has two bits of information. It consists of a possible world, which is some specific way the world could be, together with a location in that world that designates where and when you are in that world. Then there's another notion that people often appeal to, is the notion of similarity. So we'll say that two centered worlds are similar just in case they're associated with the same possible world. So for example, two similar centered worlds include a centered world centered on the first room in our example, and a centered world centered on the second room in our example, where the underlying physical facts of the situations are the same. It's also easy to come up with examples of non-similar centered worlds. So these will just be any two centered worlds that are not associated with the same possible world. So for example, take a centered world centered on an agent living in a world with totally different laws of physics. That's a centered possible world. And then take another centered world that's centered on me in this possible world. Those are non-similar centered worlds because we occupy different possible worlds. Okay, so those are two different notions, the notion of a centered world and the notion of a similar centered world. So here's how one might start giving a kind of general indifference principle in a kind of self-locating context. You might start as follows. For any two similar centered worlds, C1 and C2, If both of them are compatible with your evidence, then your credence in either one of them, conditional on being in one of the two worlds, should be 1/2. And this naturally generalizes to a finite version that conditional on any finite number of centered worlds, each of which, or all of which are similar to one another, you should assign 1/n to being in any particular one of those worlds. That's a very natural starting point. I want to emphasize the importance that the word similar is doing in this definition. So if you delete the word similar, you get to very counterintuitive places. So for example, let C1 be a centered world that represents roughly what I take my actual situation to be like, sitting here in an office talking to you all. And let C2 be a centered world that is totally empty except a floating brain in the middle of space that has the same conscious experiences as me. If you drop the word similar, then centered indifference has the consequence that conditional on one of those two worlds being my true situation, I should be 50-50 between them. And that seems extremely counterintuitive. It seems like I should favor the sort of normal possible world where I'm sitting in a normal environment talking to you all. And that's the importance of what the word similar is doing. Okay, so that's a natural starting point that a lot of people have had. I want to make a couple clarifications of this principle that are, I think, often confused, and objections are usually raised based on these confusions. So the first clarification is that center indifference does not say anything about objective chance. It doesn't say that the conditional objective chance that I'm in one of the worlds is 50-50. It only says what your credences should be, or it only says how confident you should be in various situations. It doesn't say anything about some objectively chancy indeterministic mechanism. So that's one clarification. Another clarification, which I think is important in the literature because people have objected to this principle on this basis, is that the way I formulated it, center indifference is neutral on what the correct conception of evidence is. So here's a case that illustrates how debates about how exactly we should understand our evidence might be at play. So here's a variant of our initial 2 rooms case, 2 rooms, brain in a vat. Suppose there are 2 indistinguishable rooms. In one room, there's a normal human being with their same conscious experiences. In another room, there's a brain in a vat having your same conscious experiences. So one room, normal human being, another room, brain in a vat. Question, should you be 50-50 here? And my principle is neutral on the answer to that question because it depends on what the right conception of evidence is. So some philosophers think what our evidence is something like our present conscious experiences. And on that conception, you should be 50-50 between the brain in the vat and a normal human being. But other philosophers reject that conception of evidence. They think that normal human beings have as part of their evidence that they have 2 hands and that there's a table in front of me, etc. And if that's part of your evidence, then the human being in the situation should not be 50-50 because the brain in the vat situation is not consistent with their evidence. So I just want to flag that my principle is neutral on what the correct conception of evidence is, and that might have certain downstream consequences. Okay, so that's the initial principle and some initial clarifications. I want to look at some initial objections one might have at the principle before going to how metaphysics might fit into this principle. Okay, so some initial objections. So a very common worry about indifference principles across the board is that indifference principles lead to contradictory conclusions if you're not careful. And I think this indifference principle does not lead to those contradictory conclusions. Usual indifference principles are sort of partition sensitive, and for that reason, they lead to contradictory conclusions. But this indifference principle is clear on what you should be indifferent over, namely, you should be indifferent over particular centered worlds. So here's a kind of standard problem that probably a lot of you are familiar with normal indifference principles. I'll briefly go through it. So normal indifference principles say something like the following: if your evidence is neutral between a range of hypotheses, you should assign equal credence to those hypotheses. There are famous examples that illustrate that how one thinks about one's evidence being neutral is very fuzzy. So here's an example of that. Let's call it mystery square. Suppose you're about to be presented with a square with side length between 0 and 2. and you know nothing about where it came from or how it was produced, so you have no relevant evidence on the nature of the square. Question, what should your credence be that its side length will be between 0 and 1? If you're the kind of person who likes indifference principles, you might have an initial intuition that it should be 1/2. But there's immediate problems with this because there's a way to reframe the question in terms of area instead of length that'll get you contradictory conclusions. So if the square has side length between 0 and 2, then it has area between 0 and 4. So intuitively, your credence that it has area between 0 and 1 should be a quarter, since it should be a quarter between 0, 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4. But you're certain that the area is between 0 and 1, if and only if its side length is between 0 and 1, yet indifference seems to land us into different probabilities. I think that is a very big worry for indifference principles, but I don't think it's a worry for the kind of indifference principle that I mentioned a couple slides ago. Okay, so that's the first objection to get out of the way. I don't think that similar kind of problems arise. Another few objections to address is you might think center indifference contradicts a kind of subjective Bayesian view, which says that so long as you obey the axioms of probability, you're perfectly rational. And in response, I want to just agree that it does conflict with that view, that the only constraints of rationality are conforming with the axioms of probability. But I think anyone who wants to say that we should be more confident that the Earth is round rather than that the Earth is flat has to reject subjective Bayesians. So as long as you think there's any sort of substantive rational constraints, that we should believe what scientists typically believe, we should believe that climate change is happening, we should believe that the Earth is not flat, etc., you're going to have to go beyond subjective Bayesianism. And so I'm just going to take it as a given that we can say sort of non-trivial things about what it's rational to believe, like that we shouldn't believe that the Earth is flat. I'll take that as a given. Another objection one might have is that center indifference is a sort of a priori principle that's not motivated by any empirical evidence. But here my response would be that in a Bayesian framework, all non-trivial rational constraints, for example, trying to avoid that you should believe that the Earth is flat, have to come from constraints on one's prior probabilities, and one's prior probabilities are independent of one's empirical evidence. So I think anyone who wants to say that one shouldn't believe the Earth is flat is already committed to a priori principles about rationality. So I don't think that's a distinctive worry for this kind of principle. It's a very general worry for, I mean, really, it's even a worry for subjective Bayesianism, because the principle that you should rationally obey the axioms of probability is itself a principle that doesn't come from any empirical investigation. Lastly, one might object that we shouldn't assign any probability in the two rooms case. You might think that we should just have no clue about whether we're in the first room or the second room. And there's a lot to say about this kind of attitude. I think one sort of initial thing I would say is that suppose you're playing a lottery with odds 1 in 10 to the 1,000 that you'll win the lottery. Here's an intuition that you should be more confident that you're in the first room than that you'll win the lottery. That seems to me to be fairly clear. But if you agree with that, then you think that there's something you can say about the two rooms, that you're more confident in certain things over other things. And once you start saying stuff about what you're more confident in, then you're in the territory of probabilities. Even if you don't think a precise probability should be given to whether you're in one of the rooms, suppose you think there's a sort of imprecise probability. A lot of the things I'll say later in the talk apply to that view as well. So I think even if you like imprecise probabilities, I think a lot of what I say will still apply. I think I have a couple other objections. So one interesting objection that's been raised in the literature is that center indifference threatens to violate some other kinds of constraints on rational probability. So it threatens to violate, for example, countable additivity. So countable additivity is the view that given countably many mutually exclusive possibilities, your credence that one of them is realized should be the sum of your credences in each one. That's what countable additivity says. And this principle threatens to violate that. So consider an infinitary version of this kind of principle. Suppose there's a countable infinity of rooms, first, room 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., each with a duplicate of you. Question, how confident should you be that you're in the first room? I think the only way to assign equal probabilities here is to assign 0 to all rooms, and that's going to violate countable additivity. because the sum of all the rooms has to equal 1, but 0 plus 0 plus 0 doesn't equal 1. I think this is an interesting question what to do here. I'm inclined to just think this is a counterexample to countable additivity, and I'm inclined to think there's just other independent reasons to violate countable additivity. But if one is squeamish about this, one can just restrict the principle to work in finitary situations. I think that'll still be an interesting principle, but to me, it strikes me as a bit of an ad hoc, but that's one thing one can do in this kind of setting. One last objection before I move on. So one might object that center indifference conflicts with other rational norms, such as deferring to objective chances. One might think that one should conform one's confidences to the objective chances. One might think that one should prefer simple possibilities over complicated ones, or explanatory hypotheses over unexplanatory ones, and one might worry that center indifference conflicts with that. In response, I don't think it conflicts with any of those norms. So long as you think objective chances only apply to sort of non-indexical kind of objective facts about the distribution of matter and energy across space and time, then center indifference is not going to be in tension with deferring to objective chances. I think it's also hard to make sense of how one center might be sort of simpler or more explanatory than another, given that both are equally real and there's going to be someone occupying each of the centers regardless. So I don't think this principle is in tension with any sort of other standard norms of rationality. Okay, so a brief slide about why one might like the principle. So the main reason to like the principle is just the standard reason that people have been motivated to like indifference reasoning. It seems like any other credence in these kinds of cases seem arbitrary and not principled. You could, in principle, you could assign like, 0.27 and 0.73 or whatever, but that seems like there's no reason to do that. So it's a combination of the standard kinds of reasons and the standard objections to indifference principles don't apply. I think another interesting motivation for center indifference is that violations of center indifference lead to sort of weird disagreements between equally rational people with the very same evidence. So for example, consider the two rooms case again, and to sort of dramatize the situation, suppose that both people know that the person in room 1 is about to be killed. So there's really high stakes in what room you're in. Given center indifference, both of you in both rooms agree that there's a 50% likelihood that you'll be killed. However, suppose each of you assigns a 70% credence that I'm in room 2. And if you're both subjectively indistinguishable, then presumably you're going to assign the same credences. Then there's going to be this weird disagreement that you have with your twin in the other room. So you're going to think that your twin will most likely be killed, and your twin will disagree. Your twin will think that you will most likely be killed and that they will survive. So there's this weird disagreement about who's about to be killed, you or your twin, even though you're both equally rational and even though you have the exact same evidence. And this is entirely avoided if you like center indifference. But if there's violations of center indifference, there's going to be these weird indexical disagreements among equally rational people with all the same evidence. Okay, so that's just getting the principle on the table and some initial motivations for it and responding to some existing objections to it in the literature. Now I want to turn to looking at how debates in metaphysics might be relevant to this principle. So I'm inclined to think, as formulated in the literature, center indifference is actually sort of crucially ambiguous in a few different ways. And it's ambiguous because it utilizes talk of possible worlds, but how you understand possible worlds is going to be sensitive to your overall background metaphysical views. So I want to start by introducing, or I'm going to be talking about two metaphysical debates. I want to start by introducing a sort of very weird debate that many of you are probably not familiar with, although I'm sure some of you are, and then I'll look at a more familiar debate. But here's the strange debate that some metaphysicians have. So there's this metaphysical debate about the status of other possible worlds. So where possible worlds are just possible ways the world could be. So there's this view in metaphysics known as modal realism, which says that other possible worlds are just as real and concretely existing as the world that we inhabit. So there's going to be other concrete possible worlds out there with different initial conditions, for example, with entirely different laws of physics. and even perhaps with no laws of physics at all. There's going to be all these possible worlds, for example, where the presidential election went out differently, or where World War III has already started, etc. So there's going to be all these other possible worlds, and crucially, they're just as real and just as concrete as the world that we think we inhabit. And all these worlds are isolated from one another. They have no relationship to one another. There's no causal relationship between things in the worlds, and there's no spatial or temporal relationship between the two things and the world, between things in different worlds. So this is a debate in metaphysics. Interestingly, there's a physicist who's advocated for a view in the vicinity. So Max Tegmark has this view about the mathematical universe where, on Tegmark's view, all possible mathematical structures exist. And we ourselves live in one such mathematical structure, but other structures are equally real, and equally real flesh and blood people live in other mathematical structures. So that's a sort of pretty strange and wild view. The normal view is what's known as actualism. So the normal view is that while there are genuine facts about what's possible and what's not possible, such facts should not be understood as being about concretely existing other universes. So only the actual universe that we live in is real and concrete. And some other account of the nature of possibility should be given that's not in terms of concretely existing other worlds. So basically, the disagreement is that everyone agrees that there are facts about what's possible and what's not possible. Some people understand those facts as involving concretely existing other worlds that are just as real as our own. And other people don't think that. They think that some other account should be given about possibility. So that's a sort of weird metaphysical debate. A much more standard metaphysical debate that probably more of you are familiar with is a debate in the metaphysics of time. And here, two standard positions in the metaphysics of time is eternalism versus presentism. So eternalism is in some ways analogous to modal realism. So according to eternalism, other times are just as real and concrete as the present time. In particular, past and future times are just as real and concrete as the present time. The world is this four-dimensional block universe where the present and the past and the future are equally real and concrete. And on this view, facts about what will happen in the future and facts about what did happen in the past should be understood as being about different concrete parts of this four-dimensional block universe. And presentism is sort of analogous to actualism. So in the sense that, according to presentism, although there are genuine facts about what will happen in the future and what did happen in the past, such facts should not be understood as being about different concretely existing parts of a block universe. According to the presentist, only the present time is the real and concrete time. There are facts about what will happen, and there are facts about what did happen, but those facts should not be understood as being about concretely existing things. Just as in the case about possible worlds, facts about what's possible should not be understood as being about real, concrete things. Okay, so those are the two metaphysical debates that I want to talk about. And I just want to flag that I know that there's a very large literature on the sort of alleged tension between presentism and our best physics, in particular relativity. One could easily have a whole talk on that topic. I don't want to derail my talk by just going on that topic, but I just want to make some brief points about why I don't think that our best physics just sort of clearly refutes presentism. So, but I'm not going to, this is not at all my focus of the talk, but I just want to briefly point this out just because I know this is a physics-focused audience. So first, I think it's a very live question in the foundations of quantum mechanics about how to understand the non-locality that seems to be present in quantum mechanics. And some interpretations think that the best way to understand this is to reintroduce absolute simultaneity. Things like Bohmian mechanics does this. And that's just a live debate in the foundations of physics, not at all settled. Also, when you look at even relativity, there are independently motivated theories that are empirically equivalent to, for example, general relativity, at least in certain well-behaved settings. This is, for example, Julian Barber's account of shape dynamics is an account that's supposed to be equivalent to general relativity in certain well-behaved settings, but it utilizes absolute standard of simultaneity. So those are just examples of views that are, I think, serious views that shouldn't be considered out of hand, that utilize an absolute relation of simultaneity. Also, I just want to flag that in other work, I've argued that if the laws of physics are Markovian, in the sense that the past can only influence the future by way of the present, then I think that actually is an argument in favor of presentism by way of physics. So I think if physics turns out to be Markovian, I think that might be evidence in favor of presentism. I'm not going to defend that here. And I think it's a really interesting question whether our physics is Markovian, which of course Jacob has some very interesting stuff on, but I'm not going to talk more about that. I just want to flag that, these are highly contested issues, and I think it's not at all settled that presentism is false. Okay, so those are just two metaphysical debates, one about possible worlds, are they just as real and concrete? And about times, are past and future times just as real and concrete at the present time, that I wanted to get on the table. And once one has those debates on the table, the principle that we started off gets a bit unclear. So here's the first potential source of ambiguity of how the principle accounts for being indifferent across other times. So suppose you're a presentist and you're convinced that the only concretely existing stuff is present stuff. And suppose you're convinced that there will be certain subjectively indistinguishable copies of you, or perhaps that there were in the past certain subjectively indistinguishable copies of you. Question, are you required to be indifferent towards these copies of you at different times? I think it crucially depends on our understanding of possible worlds. So to answer this question, we need to know, on a presentist view, are these copies at different times, do they occupy similar centered worlds? And to answer that, we have to answer the question of, do these copies at other times occupy the same world? And I think there's just two different things you could mean by world here. So by world, you could just mean the whole of concrete reality, which would imply that only things that exist at the same time occupy the same world. Or by world, you can mean not only everything that concretely exists in the present, but also everything that did concretely exist and everything that will concretely exist. And if you mean that by world, then you have to be indifferent across different people at different times. So there's just this ambiguity of how the presentist should understand world. A similar ambiguity happens if you're a modal realist and you think other possible worlds are just as real and concrete as the actual world. So the question here becomes, should you be indifferent towards other subjectively indistinguishable copies of you that exist in different possible worlds that concretely exist if you're a modal realist? And here again, it depends on what we understand by world. If by world one means something like the whole of concrete reality, then one should be indifferent across copies of you across different universes, across different possible universes. But if by world you mean something like an individual universe where everything is related to each other, then you should not be indifferent across different possible universes. So there are these potential ambiguities in the principle. And to try to sort of resolve this ambiguity, one can formulate different precise principles that resolve this ambiguity in different ways. So to resolve this ambiguity, I'm going to introduce some purely stipulated notions. So I'm going to stipulate that by a possible world, I mean to refer to a way that the whole of concrete reality could be. So if you're a presentist, worlds are three-dimensional things that exist at a single time. If you're a modal realist, the world will just be all possibilities. I'm also going to stipulate what a universe means. So by a possible universe, I'm going to stipulate it to mean a single space-time. A universe refers to a unified space-time. And here I want to define universe in such a way that even presentists can accept that, for example, Shakespeare and Einstein are in the same universe. So on a presentist construal, by universe, I mean everything that did exist, does exist, and will exist in a sort of spatiotemporal arena. Okay, So once we've stipulated what we mean by world, and once we've stipulated what we mean by universe, we can introduce some new vocabulary. We can say that two-centered worlds are 3D similar if they're associated with the same universe and time. We'll say that two-centered worlds are 4D similar if they're associated with the same universe, regardless of what time it is. We'll say that any two-centered worlds that are possible are 5D similar, or 5D is the fifth dimension is something like the modal dimension. We'll say that two-centered worlds are similar, period, without qualification, if they're associated with the same possible world. So those will just be a bunch of stipulated notions. And once we stipulate all these notions, we can just define up a bunch of different principles that we might like. And each of these change center indifference just by adding a notion of 3D, 4D, 5D, or without a notion. So there's XD center indifference that looks just like our original notion of center indifference, but you input 3D, 4D, 5D, or nothing at all. So an important note I want to make here is that judgments about 3D, 4D, and 5D similarity are metaphysically neutral in the sense that everyone should agree which centered worlds are 3D, 4D, and 5D similar. But judgments about similarity, period, will not be. So presentists will understand similarity as 3D similarity. Actualist eternalists will think that similarity coincides with 4D similarity. And modal realists will think that similarity coincides with 5D similarity. So just to give a concrete example, suppose again that there's one time with one duplicate of u and another time, a second time, with two duplicates of u. 3D indifference says that you must assign equal credence to the duplicates at the second time, but you don't have to assign 1/3 to all three duplicates. 4D and 5D indifference says that you have to assign 1/3 to each of the duplicates. Center indifference, period, without qualification, says to assign 1/3 credence to each duplicate if you're not a presentist. But if you are a presentist, you only need to assign equal credence to the two duplicates at T2, and you don't have to assign equal credence to all three duplicates. Anyway, so those are a bunch of different ways one might distinguish to respond to these potential ambiguities. And now I want to make a claim. It seems to me that the best general principle that accounts for our initial intuition in the two rooms case is center indifference. So that's a claim I want to make. And I don't have any decisive arguments for this claim, but I want to try to motivate why I think that. So here are a few arguments one can give for this principle. So the first point I want to make is that 3D and 4D indifference seem to me to be restricted in an ad hoc kind of way. So in particular, 3D indifference says that even if there are other concretely existing times, you shouldn't be indifferent between them, between duplicates that exist at different times. And 4D indifference says that even if there are concretely existing other possible universes, you should not be indifferent among duplicates in those other universes either. But that seems to me to be an ad hoc restriction. So consider a principle of indifference that said, you shouldn't be indifferent across duplicates across different planets, but you should be indifferent if they're on the same planet. I hope that strikes many of you as ad hoc. What's so special about planets? But it seems to me that 3D and 4D indifference are just as bad as planet center indifference. Why is there this restriction, even if there are these other times and other possible universes? Here's a second point against 3D and 4D indifference, that both of those principles, there are certain situations where they're not even well defined. So with respect to 3D indifference, it's just not going to be a well-defined principle if there's no relation of absolute simultaneity in the world. There's just not going to be facts about which things occupy a single time. And so it's going to be unclear how to even use 3D indifference. 4D indifference is actually also not going to be well-defined given certain metaphysical views. So for example, suppose you're a presentist who thinks only the present concretely exist. It's very natural for the presentist to think that if the world evolves in an objectively chancy way, then there's going to be no facts, no determinate facts about what will happen in the future. So if there's going to be, so for example, suppose that there's going to be an objectively chancy mechanism, and depending on that objectively chancy mechanism, depending on how it goes, there might be a duplicative view in the future, and there might not be. A very standard view for a presentist to have in that situation is that just there are no facts of the matter about which people will be duplicates of you in the future. And so it's unclear how to even use 4D center indifference. And interestingly, the eternalist is not going to have this problem. So the eternalist will say there always are determinate facts about what will happen in the future, even if the world is objectively chancy. Because the eternalist will say there are objective facts about what concretely exists in the four-dimensional block. And however those concrete facts are will determine these facts about what will happen in the future. So, so I just want to say, there are certain situations where 4D indifference is not well defined. For example, if you're a presentist with an open future. Okay, last 3 points. So the third point I want to make is that 4D indifference seems to be asymmetric without a good reason to be asymmetric. And here I have in mind that 4D indifference says that even presentists have to be indifferent over a sort of more expansive range than what concretely exists. Namely, they have to be indifferent over other sort of non-concrete times. But actualist eternalists don't have to be indifferent over non-concrete possible universes. And so there's this asymmetry. Presentists have to be indifferent over a more expansive range than what they could think concretely exist, but actualist eternalists don't. There's a question of what could motivate that. Okay, so far, all of these arguments have been about 3D and 4D indifference. I want to talk about 5D indifference. So 5D indifference, we've already seen some implausible verdicts of that. So when I said 5D indifference forces me to be indifferent between my actual situation and a situation where there's just a void of empty space with a brain floating in the void that has my experiences, 5D indifference says that we should be indifferent between those two situations. Just to give another kind of interesting case, that's a sort of a toy case, not at all scientifically realistic, but I think drives the point home. Suppose science narrows down two cosmological histories for how the universe could have gone, and which one is actual turns on some objectively chancy 50-50 event at the Big Bang. One is a cycling eternal recurrence world, so there's just infinitely many big bangs and big crunches that keep on going on forever. Where each eternal recurrence is just the same as every prior one. Every epoch is the same as every prior one. On the other possibility, there's just one epoch, no eternal recurrence. So 50-50 chance for eternal recurrence, 50-50 chance for just normal universe. 5D indifference says that you're forced to be 100% confident in eternal recurrence. This is just because there's going to be sort of infinitely times more duplicates of you in the eternal recurrence world. And so if you're indifferent between all these duplicates, that'll force you to have all your credence in eternal recurrence. There's some worries about infinity here, but we can stipulate there's only finitely many copies of you in each epoch. Last point is that I think 5D indifference is in tension with other norms of rationality. So if you think that we should be able to favor hypotheses on the grounds of simplicity or explanatory power, that's going to conflict with 5D indifference, because 5D indifference says you're forced to be indifferent among centered worlds without concern of which world is simple or law-governed or anything like that. And so I think 5D indifference is going to be radically in tension with ordinary ways of reasoning. Okay, I'm done with the first part. So the first part was just getting an indifference principle on the table, noting how it's metaphysically ambiguous, and trying to argue for a particular disambiguation, which has the consequence that how you apply it is sensitive to your background metaphysical views. Presentists should be indifferent in different ways than eternalists, than modal realists. Okay, so that was all extremely abstract. I'm going to try to look at some more concrete cases in this second part of the talk, and I'll still try to end by the end of the hour. Okay, so I first just want to give a toy case that illustrates some weird things that might happen on my version of center indifference. So I think an interesting consequence of center indifference is that what empirical observations you should expect to make are in some ways sensitive to your background metaphysical beliefs. This has the sort of, I think, kind of cool consequence that purely metaphysical views, in some sense, make different empirical predictions about what you'll observe, which is very counterintuitive. You might have initially thought that metaphysical views have nothing to do with empirical predictions, but I think this is a counterexample to that. So here's a case, going to be just like the cases we've been talking about. Imagine that there's 2 times. At the second time, there's 2 duplicates of you. At the first time, there's only 1 duplicate of you. And we imagine that they're all in duplicate rooms. And we're going to number the rooms in a certain way. So at the first initial time, we'll put a 1 on the outside of the room. And at the second time, we'll put a 1 on one of the rooms, and we'll put a 2 on the other rooms. So that's a sort of picture on the slides. 2 rooms at one time, 1 labeled 1, 1 labeled 2, 1 room at the other time. Question, how confident should you be that you're in a room labeled 1? If you're an eternalist, center indifference forces you to be 2/3 that you're in a room labeled 1, and only 1/3 if you're in a room labeled 2. Interestingly, these credences are not required if you're a presentist. If you're a presentist, you don't have to assign 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. What you do have to do is assign equal credence to both rooms at the second time, but you're not forced to assign 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So what probability should you assign? Well, center indifference is sort of silent on exactly what probabilities you should assign, but I think one very natural assignment is just to say, look, there's 2 ways that concrete reality could be. Concrete reality could be such that there are 2 rooms, or concrete reality could be such that there's 1 room. Those are 2 mutually exclusive ways for objective reality to be. And you might think both are consistent with my evidence. And so maybe I should assign 50-50 to both of those ways that concrete reality could be. And if you assign 50-50, it turns out that you have to have credence 3/4 that you're in a room numbered 1, because you have to be 1/4, 1/4 the 2 rooms at the second time, but 1/4 in the room labeled 2. And yeah, so this will have the consequence that conditional on presentism, you should be more expecting to see a 1 on the outside of your room, and conditional on eternalism, you should be less confident. You should only be 2/3. So this has the interesting consequence that when you walk out of the room and see a 1, that has potential to give you empirical evidence for the true metaphysics of time. So because it's more expected that you see a 1 given presentism than eternalism, so you should update your credences in favor of presentism. This is just sort of one way that these metaphysical issues might have empirical upshots. One could run a similar kind of case for modal realism, which is extremely counterintuitive. You might have thought modal realism is a kind of canonical case where we can't have any empirical evidence. But I think a similar situation could be, I mean, it would be a very toy situation, but a similar situation could be used in the modal realist case where imagine there's, I don't have a slide for it, but imagine there's 2 different universes. One universe has 2 copies of you, another universe has 1 copy of you. If you're a modal realist, you're forced to be 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 between the 3 people in the 2 universes. But if you're an actualist and you don't think that both of these universes concretely exist, then you're not at all forced to be 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. You can have different credences. And so it might be that whether you're a modal realist or not will have implications for what you should expect to observe, because you should be indifferent across all possible observers given modal realism, but you should not be indifferent across all possible observers if you're not a modal realist. Okay, so that's a very toy case. Let me look at some more real cases. So this is a slide on the Boltzmann brain. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Boltzmann brain problem. This is a sort of description of the Boltzmann brain problem by Sean Carroll. I'll just sort of read out the description because it's exactly what I need. So here's how he introduces it. The Boltzmann brain problem is a puzzle facing certain kinds of long-lived universes. In brief, the Boltzmann brain problem arises if our universe lasts forever, or at least an extraordinarily long time, and undergoes random fluctuations that could potentially create conscious observers. If the rate of fluctuations times the lifetime of the universe is sufficiently large, we would expect a typical observer to be such a fluctuation, rather than one of the ordinary observers that arise through traditional thermodynamic evolution in the wake of a low entropy Big Bang. We humans here on Earth have a strong belief that we're ordinary observers, not Boltzmann brains, so there's apparently something fishy about a cosmological model that predicts that almost all observers are Boltzmann brains. This mildly diverting observation becomes more pressing if we notice that the current best fit model for cosmology is arguably a theory that satisfies both of these conditions. Many eternally inflating cosmology potentially do so as well. We need to face the prospect that our leading cosmological model, carefully constructed to fit a multitude of astronomical observations and our current understanding of the laws of physics, actually predicts nonsense.
Just to clarify, David, that's 10 to the 10 to the 66
Oh,
years?
yes, definitely.
Yes.
Wow, came out wrong. And yeah, that's obviously very different.
Right, thank you.
Came out wrong. Okay, great. But that's the Boltzmann brain problem that in certain long-lived universes, almost all observers will be Boltzmann brains. So I just want to note that as Carroll sets up the problem, what he implicitly appeals to is a kind of self-locating indifference principle across time. That if you look at the whole entire history of the universe, including the far reaches of the future, almost all of the observers like me will be Boltzmann brains. And I think that's significant because I think if center indifference is true, I think eternalists should accept a principle of indifference across times, but presentists are totally free to reject such a principle. So I think this is the kind of concrete case where someone has made a specific argument in the foundations of physics that it seems to me only works if you're an eternalist and doesn't work if you're a presentist. Now, it's definitely not the case that the presentist is totally out of the woods, but I think the presentist avoids the specific way that Sean Carroll sets up the problem. You could try to make the problem a puzzle for the presentist. And in that kind of case, different assumptions are going to be required. The assumption that you need is that our best scientific theories have to give us reason to think that at this very precise moment, the universe is dominated by Boltzmann brains. And that's just a strictly stronger hypothesis than the hypothesis that throughout all of history, it's dominated. And perhaps one can argue that physics suggests even that. So perhaps one can argue that the world is spatially infinite, and if the world is spatially infinite, maybe there's going to be lots of Boltzmann brains. But I think the crucial point is just that those arguments are going to rely on different kind of assumptions. One kind of version of the problem gets off the ground if the universe is very long-lived and certain things happen and you're an eternalist. But on the other kind of Boltzmann brain problem, what you need is that science supports that there's lots of Boltzmann brains right now. And that's just a very different hypothesis. And so for someone like Sean Carroll, who thinks that what we should be doing in cosmology is trying to come up with cosmological models that avoid the Boltzmann brain problem, then the project of coming up with cosmological models that will avoid the Boltzmann brain problem is going to look different if you're a presentist versus if you're an eternalist. If you're a presentist, all you need to do is to find a cosmological model where there's a time that you can locate yourself with such that it's not dominated by Boltzmann brains. But if you're an eternalist, what you need is that the whole history is not dominated by Boltzmann brains. So this is just a concrete case where a discussion in the foundations of physics, I think, is indirectly related to these issues in the metaphysics of time. Just to compare the case with the possible worlds case. Suppose you're an actualist who believes that only the actual world is concretely real. I think you shouldn't be bothered if someone says, look, there are lots of possible Boltzmann brains and other possible worlds. Even if in some sense people can convince you that most observers across possible worlds are Boltzmann brains, that's not terribly worrying. The mere fact that there are tons of possible worlds dominated by Boltzmann brains shouldn't convince you that I'm probably a Boltzmann brain. I think the presentist should have the very same attitude in the case of time. So just as the mere possibility of Boltzmann brains shouldn't worry us that we're Boltzmann brains, the presentist should think the mere fact that, billions of years from now, there'll be lots of Boltzmann brains shouldn't make us worry that right now I'm probably a Boltzmann brain. Similar kind of indifference principle is a fact in Nick Bostrom's argument that we live in a computer simulation. So do we live in a computer simulation? I think if we do, there's some interesting like indirect relevance to the foundations of physics. So for one, what we think of as the drive to find the fundamental laws of physics will not be truly fundamental. They'll just be describing the laws that operate in one particular computer program. But also, I think you should expect the laws to take a different character if you think we live in a computer simulation. So for example, you might think the laws should be sort of finitary or discrete laws if we live in a computer program that's being run by a sort of digital computer. So I think there's some indirect relevance to this question for the foundations of physics. But here's Nick Bostrom giving a very influential argument that we do live in a computer simulation. He says the following: many works of science fiction, as well as some forecasts by serious technologists and futurologists, predict that enormous amounts of computing power will be available in the future. Let us suppose for a moment that these predictions are correct. One thing that later generations might do with these super powerful computers is run detailed simulations of their forebears or of people like their forebears. Because their computers would be so powerful, they could run a great many such simulations. Suppose that these simulated people are conscious, then it would be the case that the vast majority of minds like ours do not belong to the original race, but rather to people simulated by the advanced descendants of an original race. It is then possible to argue that, if this were the case, we would be rational to think that we are likely among the simulated minds rather than among the original biological ones. So that's a pretty influential argument that we live in a computer simulation. And again, I want to note, this seems to only work if you're an eternalist. So Bostrom is relying on this indifference principle across time, across future people. And I think that indifference principle is valid if you're an eternalist, but I don't think it's valid if you're a presentist. For a presentist, so long as not every time is dominated by simulated beings, which I think, for example, the time with the first intelligent non-simulated beings won't be, then even if the history of the universe is dominated by simulated beings, the presentist, but not the eternalist, can rationally believe that they are not simulated. And again, I think this will have like concrete empirical upshot. So suppose you think that if we do live in a simulation, the laws of physics have to be, in some sense, finitary or discrete. And if we don't live in a simulation, they needn't be. Then this will be a case where views in metaphysics have sort of concrete consequences for your expectations of the laws of physics. So it might be that eternalists should have more credence that the laws of physics are finitary than the presentists, which is a very interesting consequence of these very abstract metaphysical views. So the overall moral is that given only center indifference, just as actualism allows us to rationally locate ourselves in a non-skeptical possibility, even if in some sense skeptical possibilities outnumber non-skeptical possibilities, presentism allows us to rationally locate ourselves in a non-skeptical time. Okay, so last point I want to make. So far, I've looked at some concrete cases about how presentism and eternalism might impact certain views about Boltzmann brains or simulated creatures, whatever. I want to look at whether the modal case, whether worries about possible worlds might impact certain sort of concrete cases. And I do think there are some interesting implications here. So consider the sort of classic problem of induction, which is famous from David Hume. So the classic problem of induction is what licenses us to be confident that the world will continue to behave in regular and law-governed way, given that it seems possible for the world to suddenly start behaving in all sorts of random and irregular ways. So why is induction rational, basically? And one might have some kind of initial worry of the following form, that in some sense, inductive unfriendly worlds where induction fails, seem to outnumber inductively friendly worlds. There's sort of an infinite way that the world could just go haywire tomorrow, and how do we not know we're not in one of those worlds? There's some obvious problems with this argument. So the first problem is it seems to rely on a certain kind of indifference principle across all possible worlds, but you might be skeptical of such a principle. Second problem, you might think, is there really a precise sense in which inductive unfriendly worlds outnumber inductive friendly worlds? You might think there's infinity in both cases. I think actually this problem can be made to stick if you're a modal realist. So the response to the first problem is that conditional on modal realism, you should accept this certain kind of indifference principle across possible worlds, namely an indifference principle across centered worlds. And I think in response to the second problem, there's a way to make all the numbers precise if you restrict the problem. So let's restrict our question to, can we ever have reasonable confidence in some deterministic law of physics, like the Schrodinger equation or Newton's laws or whatever? So to be a bit more precise, if we restrict our evidence to facts about the past history of the universe, which is reasonable for agents like us, we only have access to the past and the present, here's a natural principle one might formulate. I'll call it the viability of determinism. There is some possible initial segment of history, H, and some possible deterministic law, L, such that it's rational to assign positive credence to that law given that initial segment of history. So that's the viability of determinism. And it strikes me that that principle is pretty obviously correct. So for example, suppose we knew that Newton's laws have been followed for the past billions of years with perfect precision. It seems to me pretty obvious that it should at least be rationally permissible to have a non-zero credence in Newton's laws in that situation. But my claim is that conditional on modal realism, center indifference is actually just inconsistent with the viability of determinism. So if you're a modal realist, you have to think that in some sense, deterministic hypotheses are not viable hypotheses. So here is the argument. There's some math behind it, but I think the gist of it can be done in English. So the gist is that there's only one universe where both L and H are true, precisely because L is deterministic. So what it means for L to be deterministic is there's only one way for the history to go. However, there are uncountably many universes where H is true and L is false. So there are uncountably many possible worlds that start off agreeing with H, but then later disagree with L. They veer off in strange ways. So for example, it might be that in R seconds from now, for any real number, the world could veer off. So if there are at most countably many subjectively indistinguishable copies of me in the world where L and H are true, because there are uncountably many copies of me in worlds where H is true and L is false, center indifference is going to require you to assign a credence of 0 to the unique world where L and H is true. So center indifference is going to say that you can never have positive probability in a deterministic law, even given the past total history of the universe. And that crucially uses this kind of indifference principle that I think is valid for modal realists, but not valid for actualists. A couple caveats to this, I think, are there countably many subjective duplicates of me in the actual world? I think yes, but things get iffy if you're a many worlds, or maybe there's uncountably many branches. Second caveat is that an instance of countable additivity is needed for this argument to work. Anyway, so that's the second caveat. The moral is that there's a precise sense in which modal realism leads to a kind of inductive skepticism, in the sense that no amount of evidence could ever give us positive credence in a deterministic law. Okay, last slide of conclusion, and it's 2 o'clock, so this is good. Okay, so just I wanted to have one last slide on summarizing what I've done. So I've started with this initial case of 2 rooms, where I hope that a lot of you have the intuition that you should be 50-50 between the 2 rooms. And the whole project is to try to generalize that initial intuition. One could try to generalize the intuition in a way that you should be indifferent across all possible centered worlds, but we've seen that's problematic. It's equivalent to what I've called 5D indifference is problematic. And so to avoid these problems, I think the right way to restrict the indifference principle is to apply it to centered worlds that are associated with the same possible world. I've argued that this raises the question of what a world is, and I've argued that on different metaphysical views, different things should be said about this. If you're a presentist, if you're an eternalist, if you're a modal realist. And a consequence of that is that indifference principles are going to be sensitive to your prior metaphysical beliefs about what concretely exists. And I've argued that because of the sensitivity, presentists and actualists have the resources to avoid certain skeptical puzzles that are faced by eternalists and modal realists, namely the Boltzmann brain problem, Nick Bostrom's simulation argument, and the problem of induction. And that's it. That's all I have. Thank you.
All right, everybody, so we're about to start the Q&A. The first hand I have is from Barry. Barry, please go ahead. Barry, can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. Hi. So thanks, David. That was very, very interesting. Self-locating credences are very puzzling, so it's great to think about them. I've been thinking about them too, and I don't know what to think. But I took your talk as consisting of great arguments against your indifference principle. You had many, many great arguments against that principle. But I want to begin by asking a question about what you would say about this. Suppose that someone is going to flip a coin that's biased with a 0.8 probability chance, that is, say, a real chance, you're going to end up in room 1 and 0.2 end up in room 2. You find yourself in a room. You don't know which room you're in. What should your credence be?
And David, do you want to unshare your screen so we can see everybody, if that's okay?
Yep.
Great.
Yeah. In that kind of case, you should just follow the objective chances. So I think so go with
Why? Well, wait a second. You don't know the objective chances. Why should you follow them?
Or it was 0.8. There's a coin with 0.8.
Yeah, you don't know them. No, you don't know them.
Oh, so there is a coin that is biased, but I don't know how biased it is.
You don't know anything about. You don't even know there's a coin there.
Okay,
maybe.
I just didn't understand the case. So the crucial thing is what information I have. So if the case is I find myself in one of the rooms, do I know that both rooms are occupied by a duplicate of me, or one of them is empty?
Let's suppose that's true.
Okay, I suppose that both have a duplicate of me. Then I think I should be 50-50.
And one of them has you, and one of them has a duplicate of you.
Yeah, then I think I should be 50-50. I don't know if that's consistent with the coin setup, because the coin setup, like 0.8, what happens, and 0.2, what happens.
But 0.8, you'll be in one room, and 0.2, you'll be in the other room.
I don't understand. So you're tying the subjectively chancy thing with a sort of purely like indexical hexatistic kind of thing. So I understand how you can tie objectively chancy things with like qualitative distribution of matter and energy on space and time. So I can understand, like, if the coin lands one way, you distribute matter and energy across space and time this way. If the coin lands another way, you distribute another way. But these like purely hexatistic things are like, if the coin is 0.8, your hexaity goes there or something. I don't see how that could be physically possible.
So in other words, what you're rejecting is that there's a fact of the matter about one of them being you, as opposed to the other one.
No, I reject that your situation is a possible situation, that you could have a 0.8 coin where what ends up is that both rooms are filled, but there's a 0.8 chance that I'm in one of them. I think
so in one of them, there's a point when there's certainly you can have a coin with these chances, right?
It depends if the you can obviously just have a coin that's 0.8 biased. You can obviously have that.
Okay, and so the idea is that when the coin is flipped, and depending how it ends, you're thrown into one room or the other room, and some guy who looks just like you shows up in the other room.
Okay, good. I understand that. Yeah, so then I think it'll turn on our conception of evidence, which my principle was neutral on. So if your evidence consists of what happened to you in the past, so part of my evidence is that I grew up in Texas or whatever it is, then I should not think I'm the duplicate that was thrown in the other room. If my evidence is just my present conscious experiences, then I should be 50-50. So I think in that case, it crucially turns on, is your evidence just your present conscious experiences? Or is your evidence external facts about what happened to you?
Well, it's a lot more to argue about this, so I don't want to take up more time. But I mean, the main point is that I think objective chances should determine what your credences are in some sense. Okay, but I think you're really rejecting that. Okay, but that would require argumentation here. The other point is that given all of your arguments, what you've shown is that your indifference principle together with other fits together with other metaphysical principles that you like, but people who don't like those other metaphysical principles would take that as reasons to reject the indifference principle.
Yeah, I guess for any argument, you could always modus tollens or something. So yeah, I've argued that certain presentists and actualists have avoid certain problems that eternalists and modal realists. If you're committed in eternalism and modal realism, I could see you modus tollensing. But I think you can't just modus tollens, because I mean I've tried to give lots of positive arguments for the principle. So I looked at 3D indifference, 4D indifference, 5D indifference. I've tried to give specific arguments against all of them. So I think you can't just modus tollens. I think you have to tell me, like, why are these other arguments that
okay, I'm going to stop. We can fight it separately. Okay.
Thanks, Barry. The next hand I have is from Richard. Richard, go ahead.
Okay, I have a simple question, but I am struggling with finding any possible answer to it. And the simple question is, what do you mean by concrete? Such that we're talking about a world as being the whole of concrete reality. And this is a particularly pertinent question if you look at Max Tegmark's mathematical universe, which is presumably something that most people would take to be an abstract reality. So what makes a possible world, or any kind of world, the whole of concrete reality?
Good. That's really a question of which there's a lot of disagreement. I mean, one standard characterization is concrete things have causal powers. Another kind of standard characterization is concrete things are spatiotemporal kind of things. It is standardly
Could there
true
be a
that
possible world which has no causal relations within it, no causal relations to the actual world, and indeed has no space-time?
yeah, if it's totally non-spatiotemporal and non-causal, yeah, there's a question about how to understand concrete. I think so. One way to understand it is, I mean, and this will, I mean, everything I say will be controversial, but with respect to mathematical entities, there's a popular sort of structuralist position that mathematics only tells you the structural relations between things. And you might think what distinguishes concrete, and these mathematical objects in themselves don't have any kind of intrinsic nature to them. They just have relational facts. You might think what distinguishes concrete things from abstract things is concrete things do have intrinsic natures to them that are not purely relational. Obviously, it's controversial. Some people are structuralists about the physical world, but I think a problem with structuralism about the physical world is that it threatens to collapse the distinction. I think for the Tegmark case, I think what's crucial, I think, is that, so Tegmark thinks that I'm conscious, and he thinks that I live in a mathematical structure, and he thinks other mathematical structures have conscious beings in them. And so long as there are conscious beings in these mathematical structures, then I think the indifference principle will kick in, and I should be indifferent among these conscious beings in different structures. So yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways to draw the distinction. But yeah.
But do you think there is a distinction to be drawn?
Yeah, I think how you should draw it will depend on your background commitments, like if you're a structuralist about mathematical entities, but not a structuralist about physical entities. But I think relative to a wide variety of background commitments, I think there is a distinction to be drawn.
Thank you.
Thanks, Richard, and very nice to see you. Chip, go ahead.
Hi. So getting this special tool to handle Boltzmann brain cases for the presentist relied on them adopting a different kind of centered indifference principle from the eternalist. So I wanted to go back to that key point. Why shouldn't the presentists adopt the 4D centered indifference principle? So reviewing that, but also, I mean, as I remember it, you were saying that it's because for the presentists, the future is open. There are many different things that could happen. And, you know, they can still deal with that, adopting a 4D centered indifference principle by thinking, well, there's a lot of things that could happen in the future, but however it goes, it looks like there's going to be Boltzmann brains. And so I'm still going to assign a high probability to being somewhere in the future. A defender of eternalist also doesn't know how the future is going to go, but they can, you know, assign conditional credences given different possible futures about where they'll be located in time. So, okay, that's my question.
That's really true. Yeah. Great. So, I mean, technicality, I think that everyone should endorse the same principle, namely center indifference, but then how you apply it will depend on your metaphysics. And why do I like that? I gave several different reasons. Okay, yeah. So first, it seemed to me that 4D indifference was restricted in an ad hoc way that was similar to planet center indifference. So 4D center indifference says that even if there are other concrete island universes, like David Lewis thought, you should not be indifferent between them. And I was thinking,
yeah, maybe to clarify my question, I didn't want to go into the modal realism, and I didn't mean 4D indifference across the board, like regardless of your metaphysics, you should adopt 4D indifference. I was wondering whether the presentist should adopt 4D indifference. Okay. Like the presentist is going to be indifferent across things in the 3D, and then should the presentist also be indifferent across time?
Good. I guess what I want is a general principle. And insofar as if I think endorsing 4D indifference is a general principle, I think leads to this objection. You could try to say in different cases you have different things, but I guess I would be worried about what the general underlying principle is, and if there is no general principle, I would be worried about that because I want a general principle. But anyway, so I think that's one objection to the general principle. I agree that there's responses to be made about the open future thing. I just think there has to be some responses to be made because for the indifference, as stated, it just says be indifferent over everything that did, does, and will exist. But on a presentist view, there's just no fact of the matter about what will exist. You could have, I mean, things get actually very complicated for presentists and like assigning credences, because it's not as if presentists should have 1/4 credence that there will be a duplicate like this. They should just be certain that there's no fact of the matter. So that there's a weird thing about what presentists should think about assigning when they're certain that there's no fact of the matter. But there should be something in the vicinity that presentists can appeal to. So yeah, I would just be curious about exactly how that principle would be formulated. Again, I have this that for the indifference is asymmetric without a good reason for the similar kind of modal realist things. It says presentists should be indifferent over a more expansive range of what they think concretely exists, namely the times. But if you think that, why not think that eternalists should be indifferent over a more expansive range of what concretely exists, namely other universes? I'd want some kind of symmetry breaker. So yeah, I think those are, yeah, none of these are decisive. I mean, I should say that I have all these specific arguments, but for me, it just seems prima facie intuitive that you should just be indifferent over what concretely exists. And these are ways to try to convince other people. But for me, it just sort of seems like the default view when I have this thing. But yeah, I guess my main worry is I really want a general principle that works. And I'm worried for all these reasons that it's going to be hard to find a general principle that works both in the temporal and modal case that has the verdict that you described.
Okay, that clears things up. Thanks.
Hi, I'm going to invoke organizers' prerogative and ask a very quick follow-up question. So David, on that, if you could actually bring back that slide before with point 3. So I actually had a question about point 3. It should be a pretty minor question, but I'm slightly confused about something.
Yeah.
So you're looking for something that breaks the symmetry here, right? Between 4D indifference saying that presentists have to be indifferent over non-concrete times, but actual eternalists don't have to be indifferent over non-concrete possible universes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the flat-footed argument I might make contrary to that is just that even if for a presentist other times are not concrete, they will definitely exist. Whereas for an actual eternalist, other possible universes will never exist. And existence seems like a pretty good symmetry breaker.
Yeah. So certainly existence is, and there's going to be, in the modal case, the actualist thinks these other things could exist. They'll think that, and the presentists think these other things will exist.
Right.
So neither of them thinks they exist, but they both think they exist subject to this qualification of they will exist.
Will or could yes.
exist.
Right.
And then the question is, should you treat will differently than you should treat could? And I agree there's some you might just think it's bedrock and that just strikes you as clear.
I think otherwise we'd use the same word for both of them.
Yeah, that's true. That they're obviously different phenomena, but yeah, I guess I just want something more than because obviously they're different. I mean, I can imagine someone just saying the opposite asymmetry of like we should be indifferent over other possible times, but not over what will happen or something.
I mean, talk to anyone with an anxiety disorder and ask them if will and could have the same meaning.
They certainly have different meanings, but you want to say that the asymmetry goes one way, and I'm thinking why? I mean, you can imagine someone saying the asymmetry goes the other way, and why go that way rather than another way? So yeah, it's not at all decisive, but I think it's at least something to say.
I personally have a few more questions, but I always wait until to ask any non-trivial questions till after everybody else in the audience asks their questions. The hands I have ahead are Lev and Noel. We have a few minutes left, so Lev, please go ahead, and hopefully we'll have time for Noel as well.
Thank you. This topic is very interesting to me, and I want to understand. But really, I have a misunderstanding of what philosophy and what physics, and so I need really clarification. I see my starting point, and maybe it's a wrong one, that we're supposed to understand our experience. Now you have this concept of presentist, eternalist, and modal realist. So I understand as a scientist, as a physics, I need to find some theory which explain my experience. If I understand presentism, it doesn't exist because I'm almost not aware of any physical theory which tells that there is a parameter now. Standard physical theory do not have this. So the standard theories are all eternalist. And all what is modern realist, I have no clue whatsoever, trying to read Lewis, but didn't help me as a physicist. So can you tell me what, in the end of the day, we have to explain it. What is, for this is such, for this is such. But there is only eternalist exist in science. There is no other.
Good. So I can't tell if that's sort of an epistemological point or a metaphysical point. So you could have the view, we should only believe things that are explicitly talked about in physics. That's one view. And if you had that view, and if you thought that physics doesn't talk about what's now, then that would maybe rule out presentism. It's in the modal realism case, it's sort of, I mean, physics just doesn't say that there are no possible universes. It doesn't say that there are. It's sort of just neutral. And so I'm not clear whether the view that you should only believe, I guess if you only believe what physics explicitly talks about, maybe you should not believe in other possible universes. And yeah, so that's a view. I mean, I think a lot of people have thought there's lots of other things that perhaps we should believe that physics doesn't explicitly talk about. So maybe physics doesn't explicitly talk about consciousness, but we should believe that we're conscious. Physics doesn't explicitly talk about morality, but we should think some things are good or bad. Physics doesn't explicitly talk about, mathematical entities, or maybe you think it does, but the question of whether there are mathematical entities, you might think is a question that physics doesn't talk about. So you might think there's all sorts of things that physics doesn't explicitly talk about that it seems like there are sensible questions about. Like, take the question, like, are fish conscious or something? It seems like a good question, but physics doesn't explicitly talk about it. Should we therefore conclude that fish aren't conscious? It seems like a bad inference. So yeah, I guess I would put pressure on the view that if physics doesn't talk about it, we shouldn't believe it. I mean, myself, I think, I sort of briefly mentioned in the slides that I'm inclined to think if physics is Markovian, then physics actually supports presentism. And that's obviously something I've not defended here, but I've just stated, but I have a paper on it if you want to look at it. So I think there could be indirect consequences between physics and these views. And I've tried to give some indirect consequences here. So I've tried to say, look, there are these concrete questions in physics about Boltzmann brains, or whether the laws of physics are finitary, discrete, whatever, that I think there are some indirect relations between the issue of whether presentism is true and what should we think about how likely it is that we're Boltzmann brains. And so I think there are indirect points of contact with these things. And so it's not totally isolated from the physics.
So then just maybe one clarification, which I put in the chat, and I want to be sure. You mentioned Boltzmann brain. So there is an idea, there is a real world which physicists talk about, Big Bang and so on. Oh, maybe there is a big computer which concludes this, and then we try to understand which possibility of which version is more plausible. So you started with ideas that there is one real you and another you in a brain. That's all. So what did you consider? Clearly, the two have the same experience. So you now kind of think, what option is more plausible? Or, as I thought that maybe in other situations, this is what David thought that you mean something different. Somebody told you that in the universe there is a real world, and somebody built a room with your brain. And now we have to know who you are. These are two very different questions. I think for the second, obvious half, and for the first one, very close to one. So which question you consider?
So I think if you had in mind the two rooms, Bolt's brain and vat kind of case, I had in mind where for certain there are two rooms, and for certain one of the rooms is populated by a human being, and one of the rooms is populated by a brain in a vat. And both people in the rooms know this. So the brain in the vat and the human knows that there are two rooms. One is populated by a human, one is populated by a brain of that. Everything else is normal, the normal laws of physics, normal universities, Zoom talks, etc. And the question is, if you know all of those facts, how confident should you be that you're a human versus a brain in the vat? And then I want to say 50-50, and I think you agree with that.
Yeah, okay.
We have just 2 minutes left, and I want to get Noel in before we go. No, go ahead.
So this is really quick. I have a kind of question or worry about the very first application case, right? So like for sake of argument, I'll grant that the presentist assigns higher credence to one. You come out of the room, you see one on very flat-footed accounts of confirmation that bumps up that hypothesis. I guess my worry is the gloss of describing that as an empirical consequence of the view seems too fast, because what I would really like is some story about how you could like replicate this experiment many times and get long range frequencies that converge towards something that would tip you one way or the other. And given the kind of disconnect between stuff about objective probabilities and things that we can physically manipulate, and then this sort of hexaetistic self-locating stuff, I'm not seeing how we could replicate this and get the sort of long run frequencies that I would like to think of as the empirical test that would tell us something about the difference between these views.
Noel, that was literally the question I had written down that I was going to ask if we had extra time. So thanks. You just killed 2 birds with 1 stone.
Good. I basically just agree with your question. I mean, it all depends on what you mean by empirical observation or something. I think it's in the sense that there are observations that you could make such that if you made them, they would empirically confirm presentism. I think that's true. This kind of long-run objective frequency trials, the community of scientists doing those things, I agree with that the kind of thing that I have in mind doesn't have that. There's some very indirect things that might have that. So I mentioned very briefly of like, if we are living in a computer simulation, the laws of physics seems like they have to be digital or finitary. And if you think that conditional on eternalism, we should increase our credence that we're living in a simulation, then presentism makes this empirical prediction that you should have lower credence that the laws of physics are finitary or something. And so finding out that they're finitary or something would be a small boost for eternalism. So that's a very abstract way of reasoning to get what you wanted. But yeah.
Great, thanks.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to everyone for participating, and thanks so much to David for an incredibly interesting and very provocative talk. I really appreciate you were here with us today.
Thanks,
and I'll see everybody next time we do this. It's good to see everybody.